Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank you for coming out on a rainy day, but that happens in St. Louis in the spring and fall and summer and maybe wintertime too sometimes. How many people were able to get a good parking spot? Well, you probably got a better one than I did. I'm out on Lindell. This is the biggest audience I've spoken to here in many, many years, going back at least 10 years or so to 2006 or so. But I want to tell you a little bit about myself and the organization. I joined the society in 1997, and I've been in for 25 years. The society started in 1986. If you didn't get the free handouts, I don't know how many more there are at the entrance, but we have some free handouts about the World's Fair and the Ferris wheel and the society. If you want to go back to the entrance and get some of those, you can study those during the presentation if I am quiet enough, but I'm going to try not to be. And you'll do a lot better on the quiz at the end. The society meets once a month. There's presentations about the fair. We publish a World's Fair bulletin once a month. And at our meetings, lots of different presentations and information about the fair are passed around. Could I ask all society members to please raise one or both of your hands and wave? If you have more questions about the society, please feel free to ask them, and they'll tell you how much they've learned and just by reading the bulletin and coming to the meetings about the fair. They could probably give this presentation, or not. So I got involved with the fair when I found out my great-grandmother went to the fair, and I have a souvenir with her name on it, one of those little ruby flash toothpick holders with her name on it, and I thought that was really cool. And the more I learned about the fair starting 25 years ago, the more amazed and astounded I became, and I've been researching it ever since. There's a couple of other members that have been around a long time. Steve Schmitz knows everything about the Ferris wheel, and he's back by the entrance next to our bulletin editor, handing out the handouts. He's been studying the Ferris wheel longer than I've been in the society. So his knowledge about the Ferris wheel is unparalleled. But I'm going to get started here before too much. These are some of the topics we're going to cover. And these are some of the typical questions that come up. How did they build it and why? And what was new at the fair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So back in the late 1800s, large eastern cities had movies and museums and large amusement parks like Coney Island. But in the rest of America, entertainment often traveled to the audience. Circuses, large and small, traveled the country by train, setting up in fields near towns for a few days of performances. Buffalo Bill and Frederick T. Cummins put on Wild West shows across America and even went to Europe to celebrate the vanishing frontier of America's West. But another type of entertainment and education also captured the attention of the world. The Victorian Fair World's Fairs displayed the products, culture, and art from countries, from around the world, and even put foreign people on exhibit. This picture is from the Dedication Day program of April 30th, 1903, which was attended by President Roosevelt and former President Grover Cleveland. The picture of the fair is a year before the fair, and it's was modified quite a bit in that last year or so. So they started having World's Fairs back in 1851 in London. We had a centennial in Philadelphia. Paris had a couple of big ones. Chicago had a big one in 1893. And St. Louis had tried to get the 1893 Columbian Expo to celebrate the discovery of America 400 years, but it was given to Chicago instead. And one man took that as a personal affront, David Rowland Francis, who had been St. Louis mayor and the Missouri governor for 4 years. And then he went to work for President McKinley as Secretary of the Interior for a year or two. And he really learned how to get money and work the wheels of financing. In fact, he was probably the most famous St. Louisan that didn't have a statue. And the people of St. Louis Hills in South City erected a statue based on all private donations back in 2019 of David R. Francis in the middle of Francis Park, which he donated to the city in Christmas Eve, 1916. So he put together $15 million capital to begin work, with $5 million from private stock sales, $5 million from the city, and $5 million from the federal government, which was approved in the middle of 1901. And at that point, as it says at the bottom, they began site selection and planning for the fair. They found in late 1903 that they were still paying a lot of salaries, but they didn't have any income coming in because the fair hadn't opened yet. And so they had to get another federal loan, which was paid back in full. And they even made a profit on the monies that they had borrowed, etc. In mid-1902 also, it was delayed to 1904 so that Europe would have enough time and all the European countries to build significant buildings and contribute. And the Olympics that had been awarded to Chicago in the middle of 1902 were also transferred to St. Louis after appropriate pressure from the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, otherwise known as blackmail. So when and where was the 1904 World's Fair held? How many people would say the fair was held in Forest Park? Is that 100% true? No, let's find out about that. So as they got the money organized, they began to look at different locations to host the World's Fair, from Carondelet and O'Fallon Park in the north, southwest St. Louis, where David Francis owned a lot of land, and the yellow area shows where Forest Park is. On a 1904 map, these show kind of the same locations of the areas that were considered, but you can see by the roads and street pattern that the city was growing out towards Forest Park, straight to the west. So the city said, well, you can have half of Forest Park, the western half, where those buildings are located, but the eastern half we've already developed, and that is the city's playground and park. So you can have that, and a lot of the infrastructure was already there. Take a look at that on a modern-day map, and let's be a little bit more precise. There's where Forest Park is, at the edge of the city limits, and there's the World's Fair, cropped down to show just the World's Fairgrounds, with the major landmarks that were there during the fair and are still there today that many people would know. Notice the Muni was not on the fairgrounds. Okay, so there's the map again of today. And now let's put the World's Fair map over Forest Park, and you can see it just occupied the Forest Park out to Skinker Boulevard, but they also had land that they leased all the way out to Big Bend. And we'll take one more look at that, and I've highlighted the leased tracts of land that they rented from Washington University, which was under construction at the time. The university was still downtown, and they, worked out a deal between the Washington University people and the World's Fair people to lease the land and the buildings for the fair and for the duration of the fair. And even though it was delayed, they paid him an extra $100,000 to WashU and got to keep it until January 1905. So now you know that it was only half in Forest Park. They immediately had some construction challenges, though, the biggest of which, right on up front, was harnessing the River des Peres. So if we look at this map here, you can see a little bit of the River des Peres, and I'll talk a little bit louder over here. The River des Peres came in from the north, and along here, you can kind of see a wiggly line that goes through the fairgrounds area, and wiggles around here. There's a big lake over here, and it finally exited the fair over here. And a lot of this was swampland, and when it rained a lot, it would flood. Well, they couldn't have that and have the World's Fair in the middle of 8 or 10 inches of water. So they made a decision to bury the River des Peres, and if you see the blue line that comes in there and then works around the buildings and exits the fair in about the same place. And they filled in part of the lake over here and put some of the buildings up on piers and stuff like that. And that lasted for the fair very well and kept the fair dry. But after the fair, a tropical storm, here's how they buried it. 3 14-foot wooden channels were dug into the ground and had to be slightly sloped so that the river would all flow downhill. This is a picture from a partially constructed Palace of Varied Industries. And as we zoom in, you can see over on the right those three channels and with a flat top, and then the dugout channel that goes underneath it, a farmhouse that was soon to be demolished. And look at the piles of lumber. Lumber was cheap. Well, that lasted up until 1915 or so, when a large tropical storm moved over the city of St. Louis and dropped about 7 inches of rain. And those channels couldn't handle it. They maybe got clogged up and stuff. And there's the History Museum with its open loggia. And you can see that the water is going up the stairs there. This is on de Bolivar looking south. Well, they issued a $11 million bond issue to bury the River des Peres in some concrete channels. And right in the center here, you can see the History Museum, the building that was built after the fair with profits from the fair. And you can see this big tunnel that is still there today to carry the River des Peres underground all the way through and down to the River des Peres we know today down near Macklin. An aerial view of the fair that was drawn by Norbury Wayman around 1950. It's extremely accurate, and it shows the buildings as built based on photographs from the fair. And over to the right, you can see the red buildings of Washington University, and going all the way out to Big Bend Boulevard, where the stadium and the gymnasium are. Even today, although the gymnasium got rebuilt as a fitness center. So here's what they built with all those piles of lumber, besides burying the river. They started building up, and they built palaces that were 50 to 80 feet high with scaffolding around them, with a wooden framework, and then they put staff on the outside of them. Staff is mainly plaster with a little bit of concrete and binder in it, and it could be shaped, poured, sawed, and sculpted. This little kid who went out to visit the fair with his parents probably is more interested in his little box of Cracker Jacks than what's going on behind him. Another view looking down at a palace under construction with the wood going up and the humongous piles of lumber that were used. Another view, and notice that big, looks like a highway curving around. That's the River des Peres burial site. And you can see a couple of palaces that are about done, and over to your right, the Palace of Manufacturers just getting started under construction. Look at the size of the people. Now, I'm going to say that several times to just impress you with the size of the fair. This is a rear view of Festival Hall. To your left, off camera, would be the Art Museum. And Festival Hall is still under construction. The rectangular part is where the organ was, the offices and toilets. And then the round area is where the auditorium was that 3,500 people could sit in. And obviously it's still under construction. You can see that one of the windows and skylights is a place where they're lifting up pieces of staff to put in place, including the Statue of Victory that is on top, but not yet there. Can you see the workers that are taking a lunch break? Oops, down in the lower left, sitting on the edge of the round part. Where's the button? Right here. And they climbed up ladders here to put on the gilt and to finish all this sculpture, to lift sculpture up into place. A very impressive building, over 200 feet tall. This was the goal, to build palaces that would impress the heck out of people. And this picture is one of the best to do that, because if you look in the lower right over here, you can see people standing next to a statue in the base of the statue, and then the statue, and then the roof line up here, and then the sculptures that are on top of the roof. How'd they get those up there? Look at the people in the distance. They look like ants 700, 800 feet away. And the buildings still look pretty large. Well, let's talk about some innovations and firsts at the fair. There's a lot of those. Not everything was invented that you've heard about, and I'll be glad to take questions at the end on some of those. But Festival Hall, as I said, had a large auditorium, and they decided to make it a performance auditorium and have the world's largest organ built and placed in it. Along the top of Art Hill, is the Colonnade of States, which is kind of where the parking lots used to be, and now they got moved back a little bit. Now there's a line of trees right along the crest of Art Hill. You can barely see just a little bit of the art museum right here. The rectangular part is part of Festival Hall, but that slanted part right there is part of the art museum. Just to show you the scale, that Festival Hall was more than twice as tall as the art museum. A little different view in a real photograph. You can see the people climbing up the stairs and walkways, looking at all the statuary and fountains and spray as the cascades poured forth from the beginning of it down a waterfall, and then lots of smaller waterfalls all the way down. Can you imagine? The largest musical instrument, as I mentioned, with over 10,000 pipes, was bought after the fair and moved to Philadelphia in what was then the Wanamaker store, and it's now a Macy's, into their grand court, and that's a whole nother presentation. But they wanted more volume and more sound there, and it got expanded to 27,000 pipes in the 20 years after the fair. There's the organ in Festival Hall with the St. Louis Symphony in front of it. It was played by very famous and noted organists, including Alexander Guimont from France, noted as the world's most accomplished organist. The 32-foot wooden pipe was big enough to hold a small Shetland pony. Alabama didn't participate in the fair, but the Alabama businessmen in Birmingham decided they wanted their steel industry to be put on display, so they made a statue of Vulcan, 56 feet tall, it weighed 60 tons, and was put on display in the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy. He still exists today after a couple of side journeys. He's now atop Red Mountain outside of Birmingham on top of a 120-foot tower. The world's only the second floral clock in the world was built for the World's Fair, and of course it had to be the biggest. It's 112 feet in diameter. Each of the hands weighed over a ton. Those little pavilions, tents at the top, held several things, and we'll take a look at those. On the left is a large bell that weighs 5,000 pounds. It rang every 30 minutes. In the center pavilion is a globe that rotated accurately. The mechanism that would be triggered to move the hands of the clock, and then on the right, the masterworks to the clock, and we'll see those close up in a minute, and then an hourglass that was turned over every hour, all automatically during the day. The minute hand was so long that when it was triggered to be moved, it pneumatically moved, and the tip of the minute hand would move 6 feet. So there's the masterworks to the floral clock that kind of got lost after the World's Fair. Not lost, but the manufacturer had them. It ended up in the hands of a dentist in Milwaukee, and the World's Fair Society found them in 1990 and purchased it from him and brought it back to St. Louis, and it's on display upstairs in a corner. I bet you I didn't even know, and I bet you no one else has hardly ever heard of a pyrheliophore. It's basically a solar furnace. It was made by Father Himalaya from Portugal, of all people, and put on display, and it could run temperatures up to 6,800 degrees Fahrenheit and melt just about any metal. It won a grand prize, and today, of course, we still use solar furnaces and solar energy for electricity and stuff like that. Another technology that was coming out in 1904 was wireless telegraphy. And people were figuring out how to use electricity to produce power to transmit signals through the air. And at the time, they were pretty much limited to Morse code type things. Voice was just beginning to be transmitted. And what did they broadcast it from? Well, it turns out that the DeForest Tower, which was originally in Buffalo, New York, near Niagara Falls, as an observation tower, was available. So it was brought to the fair and erected. It served as a radio broadcast telegraph communications with downtown, and news stories were sent to the downtown newspapers from the fair. The view from up here was magnificent. Here's a large panorama, 180 degrees, that was put together from about 5 different images of the fair. Looking over towards Government Hill, you can see the Dome of Missouri and the large U.S. government building, the palaces of liberal arts and mines and metallurgy with the obelisks, an army encampment on the lower end. And then over to the right a little bit more, you can see Festival Hall, and just to the left of it, you can see the roof line of the Art Museum, and you can see, for comparison, how much larger that is. The palaces of education and manufactures, and then electricity and varied industries in the distance. How many people have been to see the exhibit upstairs and taken a look at all this? Okay, so there's going to be a quiz afterwards, so you got to pay attention to what the buildings were so that you can identify all the buildings. Take a look, though, down along the bottom walkway at the people walking around. They've just come to the fair in the early morning hours and either are going to work or starting to see some of the exhibits and stuff like that. Another new technology, though, had just started, and that was flight and aviation. People were going up in hot air balloons a little bit, and the use of hydrogen in balloons and controlled flight was just beginning. And so the World's Fair issued a challenge, an award, $100,000 to anyone in any flight vehicle that could complete a 30-mile L-shaped course at an average speed of 20 miles an hour and land near the starting point, and do that 3 times. Well, the Wright brothers had just flown, and when they heard about it, they visited St. Louis, and they said, yeah, last December we flew a few times, a couple hundred feet. We're not ready to go 30 miles or anything like that yet. So they bypassed it. But Santos Dumont had recently flown for about an hour, and he circled the Eiffel Tower one time. But a guy named Thomas Baldwin from California thought he would try his hand at building a dirigible, and he built the California Arrow. Now, Baldwin was kind of a portly man, so to speak, and he knew weight was at a premium, so he enlisted the aid of Roy Nabenshoe to be his pilot, who had never flown. In fact, not many people had ever flown a dirigible. But on October 31st, 1904, Roy Nabenshoe, after kind of a test flight that the engine ran out and he floated, went up on another flight. You can see the propeller in front and a big white rudder in the back for steering. Took off, and he flew for about an hour and a half, and he flew it up to a height estimated at 2,000 feet. This picture is taken from the aeronautic concourse looking over towards the palaces, and I'm estimating that he's probably about 600 or 700 feet tall. So just imagine he was about 3 times higher than this, and that would be about the height of 3 St. Louis arches. And if you look at this last photo, you can see that, he's got a parachute on and a safety harness, right? No. Can you imagine going that high with nothing and just hope you don't get a big leak? At any rate, the view from a captive, there was also captive balloon flights at the fair. They had a 1,000-foot rope, and for a fee, and I don't know how much it was, you could actually go up a few hundred feet and see what it was like to look down at the fair. On the left is Jessie Tarbox Beals, the only female certified photographer from the fair, and she's credited with taking a lot of good photographs of the fair and the indigenous people that were brought to the fair. It's believed that she also took this photograph, looking down at the fair. And look at that, Ferris wheel off to the right. Photoshopped for contrast a little bit, but you can see Festival Hall, and just over the top of the Ferris wheel, you can see the Art Museum on a side view. Well, when I saw this, and it was published in the 1904 World's Fair Bulletin, I thought, boy, I sure wish they went a little bit further to the right, because we had just been studying the floral clock that I showed you earlier. And I said, if it went a little bit further to the right, you could see the floral clock and see what time it was. And look at this. It's about 5 minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning. Looking down at Illinois and the Boer War Arena and the Palace of Agriculture. In the lower left, you can see a grandstand and the life-saving lake where the swimming events were held, and also life-saving demonstrations. In the Palace of Agriculture, there were also a lot of exhibits from a lot of the states that wanted to attract people to their various states. And they were putting their food products on display, such as Missouri had a 3-story, 50-foot-high corn palace. Louisiana showed a salt sculpture of Lot's wife. And Mississippi had to show, remember the story from the Bible, she looked over at Sodom and Gomorrah and poof, she was turned into salt. Mississippi made a 40-foot statue of King Cotton. California, with its booming agriculture industry, made a prune bear and a horse made of hops. And another technology was just coming into play that people were figuring out how to really make air cooler. There was a company in New York that had cooled their offices in New York City. That same technology was used to cool most of the Missouri building, the first public building to be air-conditioned, and Gardner Voorhees designed the system. Well, that system was so good it could get things down to freezing or maybe even a little bit below freezing. And as butter was shipped, it often got soft, especially in the summertime, and people learned that butter, if it was kept really cold, would make a great sculpture material. On the right is President Roosevelt in butter on horseback. Father Hennepin at the falls of the Mississippi River up in Minnesota with a couple of Indian guides. And the Victorian people also had a good sense of humor, showing a maid milking a cow and a thirsty little cat getting a drink. Well, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia had previously gone to the Chicago 1893 World's Fair, and 75,000 St. Louis children signed a petition to Philadelphia to allow, I jumped ahead one. A couple of other invented foods at the fair. Puffed rice was first demonstrated at the 1904 World's Fair, kind of like Rice Krispies. And I like to think the ice cream cone was invented at the fair, with the waffle cone being a true cone. A baked cone like this with a flat bottom, and in 1903, a copyright was granted to make it kind of like a teacup, a baked container for ice cream. That was not sold at the fair, but the waffle cones soon became a rage all over the fair. And here's a photograph of the Lion family all enjoying an ice cream cone, including Mom. So with the 75,000 school children signing a petition, Pennsylvania relented, and the Ferris, or the Liberty Bell, was put on a special train car. It took several days to get to St. Louis because it had to stop in every city on the way, where the mayor and the local school band and all the townspeople would come out and see the Liberty Bell. Of course, it was put on display in the Pennsylvania building, and people were fenced and guarded away from touching it even, because it had been nicked quite a bit and it had lost a couple pounds of weight through the years of its travels. People taking little souvenir pieces of it, apparently. I had mentioned earlier that the third Olympiad was held in St. Louis, out at Washington University primarily for the athletic competitions. There's the stadium as it was in 1904, life-saving lake with a fancy diver. Weightlifting, long jumping, and track and field events were held. And the Olympics, we're going to have a presentation in a couple of weeks, at Glen Echo, where the golf tournament was held. And St. Louis gets a bum rap because it was only the third Olympics. The Olympics were not a big thing. The colleges and the various athletic groups, the Turners and the AAU, all had their own athletic events. And St. Louis kind of said, well, we're going to have World's Fair and we're going to give bigger prizes and no one's going to go to Chicago, so you might as well have it here, and they did. And they did a pretty good job on just about everything, publicity-wise and event-wise, except for the marathon, and I'm not going to go into that today. They were the first Olympics to give out gold, silver, and bronze medals to the first three places. In 1896 and 1900, the winner would get a trophy cup of one kind or another, but we started the tradition of giving out the medals. George Poage, the first African-American, won 2 Olympic medals in hurdles. And George Iser won 6 Olympic medals in one day in gymnastics. At the age of 7, he had lost his leg, one of his legs, just below the knee, and he had a prosthetic leg, which is pretty impressive for him to do. People that have gone to the fair talk about 2 or 3 things generally, and we have a recording of some of their visits and what they've said back from 1990. They talked about how big the buildings were, and they always talked about the night views and all the lights that were on. It made it like daytime with electricity just all over the place, illuminating light bulbs and stuff like that. It turned night into day, looking across the Grand Basin with fountains. It created a dazzling spectacle looking up at Festival Hall and Art Hill. And I hope this works good because this is the first time I'm showing it. Festival Hall was illuminated, as was the Colonnade of States, with 3 different strings of lights. One was amber, and in the evening there's a couple of diaries that, as I read, would very slowly turn from amber into red. And after another 3 or 4 minutes, the red would slowly turn into green. And they would just sit there for, 15 or 30 minutes watching the lights change and the water come down, the waterfalls, etc. Well, I'll need to move on to a few other special things. Oh, and then it would go back to white and just repeat that pattern. A few famous fair attendees and peoples that were at the fair. Many people have heard the story or seen the movie about Helen Keller, who at the age of 7 months was stricken and went deaf and blind. She was trained and eventually learned to sign and use her brain quite well and get a very good education. In fact, she became the first graduate to get a college degree in 1904 from Radcliffe. She was so good and became so famous from that on October 18th, a special day at the fair was held, and she was brought to the fair with Annie Sullivan and taken on a tour. And Annie Sullivan described what she was seeing, and she was excited as if she saw it, of the large buildings, etc. Here's a bird's eye view of the Philippine exhibit, and most of you probably know that the Philippines, along with Cuba and Guam, were won from Spain in the 1898 war. Well, you can see some of the large buildings that were put there, the Bridge of Spain and the walled city. In white, you can see the different encampments, including 4 or 5 of the indigenous, less educated people that were still living in a primitive manner by what 1904 considered. And a lot of exhibits were taking place in those large buildings. Out of the 1,100 Filipinos that came, only a couple hundred were the natives. The rest of the people were parts of the military, the Philippine Scouts and the Philippine Constabulary, and they both had large bands that participated in most of the parades at the fair and even downtown, or even traveled to other cities to show that America's new colony was ready to kind of join the United States. But as I said, there were also some various tribes. The Moros live near the water, and their little children, 4 and 5 years old, would ride on their canoes, and they would dive to recover nickels or dimes that were thrown into the lake there. And then there was the Igorots, who received, I think, kind of a bun rap. They were also educated. The chief wanted a typewriter and a phone line so he could talk to David R. Francis, and he got it. and they also showed their native dances. And they found out that they were allowed to keep a small portion or a portion of the admission to their villages. So when all of those Europeans and Victorian men and women came to see them, they got to keep some of the money. Well, the Igorots had a tradition on their holidays of killing a dog and using the dog meat for stew. And we will go, oh my gosh, how terrible. Well, how many people know how sacred cows are in India? And how many people love going to get a nice big steak? Different customs, different peoples. Rumor has it they snuck out and stole dogs, and that's how Dogtown got its name, and that's not true. An 1898 newspaper talked about the police going to settle a domestic disturbance in the Cheltenham district of Dogtown in 1898. So it was well known as Dogtown before then. Another famous person that came to the fair or was brought to the fair was Geronimo. He was a federal prisoner, having been captured in 1886. He was rumored to have taken over 50 scalps. And he was a prisoner for life. He was in his 70s when he came here. But he was allowed to roam around the fairgrounds and also to sell his autographs or pictures or even his hat. And if somebody bought his hat for $2, when the person left his tent, he'd reach underneath in a box and put another hat on. Well, here's a photograph that the Gerhard sisters took. They were allowed to bring him down to their studio and took a very good quality picture of him showing his dignity. And in 2009, the Smithsonian people looked at that photograph and said, there's something in his eye. And if you look real close, you can make out a white blouse with an arm, down at the waist and a dark dress as one of the Gerhard sisters is leaning over the camera taking that picture. Another group of people less well known that came to the fair was the Fort Shaw Indian School girls basketball team. Now, basketball was a new sport by then, and the Indian schools out west were established to try to assimilate the Indian youth into the modern culture, but not necessarily destroy their old culture. So they were allowed to dress at times in their native garb, but they were also taught basketball, and they got so good at it, they were beating all the local teams. Basketball was a different sport. You could only dribble once. You had to pass the ball, and you had to shoot well, but you can see the backboard and the net down at the far end there. During intermissions or after their games, they would put on pantomimes dressing up as Shakespearean type people as different parts of Shakespeare were read or various readings. And from that money, their manager said, let's go to the World's Fair. And so they got on a train and they played teams along the way, making enough money to pay for their tickets, and came to St. Louis, where they were engaged to play a Missouri All-Star girls team, best 2 out of 3. Guess who won the first 2 games? The Fort Shaw team, and they were awarded a trophy cup from that. Well, there's also entertainment on the pike, and we'll get to the Ferris wheel. I like closing with that. One of the more popular attractions on the mile-long pike with 50 concessions, we'll talk about just a few of them, was Jim Key. Jim Key was a Hambletonian, and he could read, write, spell, answer math questions, make change, and answer Bible questions by picking out letters. Interestingly, it was never proven if Jim Key was being signaled by his trainer who would leave the stage or really was that intelligent. There's a great book about him, and it's quite illuminating. His owner, who had trained him with kindness, raised lots of money for the new Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. There was a scenic railway that you'd get in a little cart, and it would take you around and show you historic scenes and scenes from other countries before it went out on a roller coaster ride that was a couple miles long. Under and Over the Sea would take people on a trip to Paris. You'd go down and get in a small, large car-sized thing with portholes, and it would be like you were getting on a submarine. Scenes of sunken treasure and sunken ships would roll past with strange fish and stuff like that. Then you'd get out and go into another small room, and you'd look out the windows, and you were getting higher and higher, going up the Eiffel Tower. And then from the Eiffel Tower, you'd go and enter another room, and it looked like you were getting into a giant dirigible or an airship. And you'd fly across the Atlantic and look down, and you'd see ocean liners in the ships. You'd see the Brooklyn Bridge and New York City, and eventually get to Eads Bridge, and then you'd come back, and guess where you'd land? Right where you took off. Ireland businessmen put on a large exhibit, and I want you to take a look at the lower left of Blarney Castle, at how large that is. Looks like stone, doesn't it? Well, that's made out of staff that's carved and trimmed and stuff like that. And Cormac's Chapel, and they had a large businessman's exhibit. An interesting exhibit on the Pike was baby incubators. Isolettes, as they are now called, or baby incubators, were new technology back then, and the fair awarded a concession to a man who had never run them before or really didn't have a medical degree, and the survival rate of premature babies for the first month or two was not very good. Well, they brought in a man who was better trained, who put in more discipline in the feeding and care, and they also put up a glass partition along that railing so that people couldn't lean over and spread their germs onto the young little babies. Incubators were still kind of an experimental technology until the 1920s or 30s. And there were several exhibits from Asia. Adolphus Busch built a whole village on about 9 acres, a large restaurant that could seat 4,000 people at a time. And after a nice meal there, you probably wanted to go see the Ferris wheel. You can see the 2 tall towers there, the axle, and here's how they put it together after they took it apart in Chicago, because it had been built for the Chicago Fair. It was still up there, and the Chicago House Wrecking Company took it apart piece by piece, erected the supports, and started putting it together. So can you see any of the workers there that are putting it together? How about there down in the lower left and on the curved part that's sticking up a little bit? Okay. Now it's over halfway done. Can you see any of the workers? Oh, yeah. Got to look hard. I'm sorry it doesn't zoom in very well. But the original of these down at the Public Library's website is amazingly sharp. And here, can you see any of the workers up there? Oh, I heard an oh my gosh, good. And believe it or not, all the workers have hats on. Not hard hats, they're regular hats. So with this being done, I'm going to show you some statistics, and I've pre-briefed some people to show you the Great Ferris Wheel. And you can see each car and how large they were. I'm going to tell you they're 13 by 27. And, first here's a view looking over towards the Palace of Art and Festival Hall, and you can see the height of Festival Hall compared to the Art Palace. And then looking up to the northwest, you can see the foreign buildings, and kind of dark, you can see in the shade Washington University, and above them, just up about here, you can see U City Hall. And here's some facts for you, and I've pre-briefed the back 5 rows of the center section to please stand up and raise your hands. That's right, all 5 rows. Stand up if you would for a minute. Okay, that's probably at least 35, 40 people or so. That was the size of one Ferris wheel car. Thank you very much. That worked great. Well, you've had a chance to look at the capacity and 100,000 parts. It opened a few weeks after the fair. And the first day it opened, a small wedding party got on and got married when the Ferris wheel got up to the top. That was on a Saturday. Guess what happened on Monday? Somebody else got on and got married. They decorated a car so that people could get married, and there were over 50 weddings estimated during the fair. One young couple with a small wedding party had a platform built on top of one of the cars and got married. And the Ferris wheel at night was always an impressive scene, and you could actually see, this is from a photo that the History Museum helped the River City Casino make. There's spotlights shining out from it. And I didn't know the Ferris wheel had spotlights. And Steve Schmitz, who's here, looked through his collection and he found something on top of one of the cars. Well, it turns out there was a, what'd they call it? A kilocandle spotlight used on the Ferris wheel from the 1904 World's Fair that ended up out in Denver at an amusement park. Well, after the fair, it was built in Forest Park. One of the deals with the city was you got to restore it to a park, which means get rid of everything. They couldn't sell it. They couldn't leave it there, so they had to demolish and sell it at scrap. It was worth a lot of money, even the axle at 70 tons. That's about $30,000 today. So in May 1906, they blew up the Ferris wheel. And of course, the question and urban legend is, where's the axle? A lot of people think it was buried somewhere because it was too heavy to move. But wait a minute, I told you it had been moved from Chicago down here, so it wasn't too heavy to move. Everything was there to move it. And it wasn't newsworthy, it was just salvage material. And while they couldn't cut it up right away, acetylene torches over the next 10 years improved enough to be oxy-acetylene torches that could cut up the axle and melt it down for salvage. And that is the belief of Steve and most of us that have looked at the documentation that he has from the Chicago Wrecking Company and people that ran the company. Here's a copy of a 1951 letter that said it was shipped back to Chicago. It was on 2 flat cars. It remained until 18 or 19, until the acetylene torches were good enough to cut it up and sell it for scrap. And Steve woke me up practically one night a few years ago to say, I found a newspaper article that 1907 talked about it from someone who was cleaning up the fairgrounds. He talked about it was found necessary to blow off the flanges from the axle with dynamite before it could be loaded on a car. The fair has a lot of legacies, though, that benefit us today. How many people have some souvenirs from the World's Fair? A whole lot of us. For some of us, it's a near full-time hobby. Clean water is a legacy of the fair. St. Louis water looked like that. And can you imagine all those fountains and the Grand Basin having dirty water and all that staff turning brown?
St. Louis used to be known for, among other things, its muddy drinking water, brownish, cloudy river water. Too thick to drink, the saying went, but too thin to plow. It wasn't really unhealthy, it just wasn't very pretty. And in 1904, that was a problem.
St. Louis was about to have a World's Fair, and water was going to be an important component in this World's Fair. They had planned to decorate the fair with lagoons, with waterfalls, with fountains. How would it look to the rest of the world if there's muddy water pouring out of the statuary?
The city's water intake was at the chain of rocks near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, and there was still plenty of dirt in it when it was pumped throughout the city. A panel of experts looked at 2 solutions, building a filtration system or finding a new water source, but neither proposal met Mayor Wells' budget restrictions or his deadline. Whatever was done had to be in place by the World's Fair. So they tried something new, chemicals, coagulants, which pulled the dirt out of the water, and it cleared up. And even though they had to cut back on the chemicals when the seals and the fish at the fair started to die off, they got what they wanted. Crystal clear water was the visual centerpiece of the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition.
So you can thank the World's Fair for your clean water. There was a relatively small exhibit building from the Portland Cement Company that's still in business today. They made a display building in the middle of this picture out of concrete. Well, they left it in place after the fair, and as the zoo was established in 1909, it became their veterinary building and was used for the next 30 or 40 years. It was eventually taken down in 1962 when the Zoo Line Railroad was put in, and they needed a station there to honor Marlin Perkins. A few other legacies of the fair. In the lower right, you can see that there's a tunnel going through and a wall in the bird cage. That's how it was in 1904. The wall was to separate the large birds from the small birds, and you walked through and you could see them. You were not allowed into the same enclosure as the birds. And of course, the top left shows the bird cage under construction. And there's a picture of the large bird side. You can see the wall over on the far right. I like to say a legacy of the fair is the Grand Basin. There's what it looked like in 1904 in the upper left, and on the right, as it was restored in 2003 with a couple of bridges that looked just like the bridges back in 1904. Of course, the Palace of Art is probably the biggest legacy of the fair. It was built to be permanent from Indiana Bedford limestone, and here's what it looked like in 1904 with statues in those little places and chimneys, etc. And if you look real close, oh, look at that, we just jumped ahead about 120 years. There's what it looked like today. And if you missed that, let's go back and take a look at 1904 one more time. Pretty much the same. Well, I like to keep the memories alive, and that's the charter of the 1904 World's Fair Society, is to keep the memory of the fair alive in the memorabilia. The apotheosis is now bronze on a marble base. Originally, it was in staff, carved out of plaster, basically. People in the city liked it so much, they had it redone after the fair, and it was unveiled in 1906 and put in front of the Art Museum. And I just got lucky one evening when I happened to be there to take a picture from the corner of the plaza and take this picture, and I've matched it up with a 1904 shot of the same statue. And you can see there's a subgroup there called the Guiding Spirits, which a couple of angels whispering genius points, inspiration whispers into the city of St. Louis figure. And I go back to that story of the man sitting there on the edge of the Grand Basin watching the lights go from amber to red to green. And I look at a picture like this that doesn't do it justice. And I say, boy, I'd love to go back there, and I'd have to go back for at least a month to try to see everything I could. And that concludes my presentation. I hope everybody learned at least 3 things.